So we're talking about this pink line, as the radar working group insists on calling it. It's all the communication between record companies and music licensing companies, but also amongst music licensing companies. It's about the rights in sound recordings, as well as all the monetary flow, or the information about monetary flow, going back to the rights holders. There are a number of companies, music licensing companies and associated companies, that are actually members of DDEX. You see a list of logos there. I'm not going to go into any details, but we do have traditional music licensing companies amongst ourselves. We obviously have record companies, but also we have these hubs that facilitate the communication between the various parties in the room when we have these discussions. Some of those are obviously not companies on their own, but are being run by member companies, but they are part of the discussion and have to be part of the discussion. When the communication with and amongst music licensing companies was originally started, that was quite a while ago, there was a standard that IFPI has had developed and had kind of commissioned to create, which was called the MLC standard, the Music Licensing Company Standard. Alas, there is now obviously an organization in the US called the MLC, so we can't really use that abbreviation anymore. And I think we are slightly more nimble than the US government, so we changed our name. And we now call it the Recording Data and Rights Standard. At the same time, we actually broadened the standard and made it actually do significantly more things. And it was actually just not feasible to cram that all into one standard. So we now have actually 4 standards: RDR-C, RDR-N, RDR-R, and RDR-RCC. RDR-C, that's the choreography, or the communication protocol. Sorry, it used to be called choreography. It's the communication protocol standard. Mark talked about communication protocols as part of what DDEX defines. Well, that is the bit, how do the radar messages be exchanged between the different companies? It's a fairly simple process, and I don't think we'll go into much detail on that today. The focus is really on the messaging standards, the message and choreography standards, about the notification of recordings and rights and claims in those. Then the revenue reporting, which obviously goes the other way around, and then the rights claim conflict. What happens if somebody notices that a company claims rights that somebody else has also claimed? What do we do about that? We need a mechanism to resolve those conflicts. Now, DDEX doesn't resolve those conflicts, but what DDEX or DDEX standards can do is enable people to share those conflicts with each other so that they can be resolved. And the resolution can then be communicated throughout the supply and value chain again. To put that into a diagram, we have RDR-N, RDR-N. Sometimes we call it RDR because that's how the letters are, but sometimes we call it radar. It's a bit easier to pronounce. It's for making claims for rights in sound recordings and or music videos to a music licensing company. Can be sent by a record company, can be sent by another music licensing company. We have RDR-R, the revenue reporting standard, which allows revenue to be reported, again, from a music licensing company to another music licensing company, or from a music licensing company to an ultimate rights controller, rights holder. And last but not least, we have the rights claim conflict message. I talked about what that does just a minute ago, and they all are based on top of the RDR communication protocol. They all use basically the same mechanism to exchange the messages, so why repeat the same text 3 times? Also, if we if we were to find a bug in that, it's much easier to fix it once than to fix it thrice. RDR-N is basically the same as the original MLC standard. That's not the same, has been updated, but the purpose is the same. The only thing we've done is, yes, we've updated and we've taken out the communication protocol and put that into a separate specification and renamed it. Over the last couple of years, we've been finalizing 1.5, but we are now starting and have started to look at RDR 2.0 or RDR-N 2.0. We have noticed over the years that there are some things that can be made significantly more efficient if we changed some structures within the message. It perfectly well works, but there are some efficiencies to be gained, and we're trying to align how the RDR-N message works much more with ERN4, the release notification standard version 4, as opposed to ERN3, which this is modeled for because they were developed at the same time. And that has taken the working group, well, takes a lot of time in the working group to work through all of those changes that are necessary there. So we're talking about RDR-N. One of the first standards was the ERN standard. DDEX was formed in 2006, as Mark has said. The first ERN standard was developed in 2001. Before even DDEX was in existence, there was a predecessor project. And the structure that we had there was worked perfectly well, but there were some things that aren't quite optimal, especially the handling of territorial variations of specific fields, titles, and so forth, wasn't really that ideal. And so the ERN working group has updated its approach to handling those things, and out came ERN4. The latest version is ERN431 that has been published earlier this year. And RDR-N 1.4, that's the widest implemented version. That is still very much like ERN3, which was developed, I think, in 2008 or 2009. Does it say on here? So it's been significant, has some significant mileage under its belt. When we made the switch from MLC to RDR, version 1.5 was published, as Vanessa just reminded me, and that is now actually starting to be implemented as well. We see, for example, Sound Exchange has implemented that. And now we're harmonizing the requirements that are specific to the communication of recording data and rights with the structures that we have done for the ERN. In the end, a record company wants to send an ERN and a RDR message, and hopefully the structures are very similar for their own efficiencies, and we're now aligning those things together. Just to give you an example on how that looks, you always have a message header, and then you have a sound recording that provides title, ID, duration, artist, contributor ID, and name information. That's fine. ERN does exactly the same in principle. We then have this, as I said, the handling of territorial information is not quite ideal. If, for example, you have a different title of a recording in a different territory, but the name of the musician or the band is everywhere the same, you would need to repeat the different titles with the same name of the artist multiple times, or for each territory. So you have one title name pair for the Netherlands, one title name pair for for Germany, one for the UK, one for France, and so forth. But the title, the name is always the same. Why do we repeat that all the time? Well, that's how ERN3 and RDR 1.4 and 1.5 and older are doing it, whereas, and then in there you have host sound carrier information. Rights controller while they also change by territory, there is a separate list of that. So why is that different? Why is that different from that? It's both territorially different, isn't it? Makes no real sense. So in ERN 4.2 and in RDR-N 2.0, what we'll have is a message header, that's normal. We have release information, which is basically what a host sound carrier in the radar standards is. Title ID and so forth, all of that kind of information. Sound recordings. We then have, very revolutionary, a separate party list, so that actually the recipient of the message can know which parties are, or separate them. If you have in one recording 2 people named John Williams, how do you know that they are the same John Williams or separate John Williamses? And if I'm receiving a radar message, or an ERN message for that matter, from one party, from one record company with John Williams, and I receive an ERN message or a radar message from another record company with a John Williams, how do I know that it's the same John Williams? Well, if you have a separate party composite where you not only provide the name, but also an identifier for that name, that could be an ISNI, that could be an IPN, then the recipient actually has much better chance to properly identify the individual parties, and therefore, well, in the end, pay the right people. ERN has deal that is not really relevant to the radar message, but more critically there, and that's the other optimization that I started to hint at earlier. We start to allow every single tag that can be territorial different to actually have a flag inside. So you just say, well, here's the title for Holland, here is the title for France, here's the title for Thailand, and here is the name of the band, which is for everybody. So you don't need to repeat things multiple times that actually have no territorial variations. So it's more efficient, and it uses this party composite, which has proven to be quite a game changer, actually. There is a question online.
The question online is, so for processing the sound recording, you have to skip all the way to the end, in other words, read the whole file, to get to the details of the sub-objects, question mark.
In the current specification, you're correct. So you will need to go into the message, and one of the last composites is the sound recording. And then you have the individual sound recording details by territory, and you need to pass all of those before you can put the entire thing together. Now, in principle, it's the same here. What's a little bit more complex when you're receiving it, you will then need to resolve back to the parties because they're described in a different part of the message at the top. While that is true, we believe that it's much outweighed by the benefits of having actually this ability to uniquely identify parties, and to make sure that if I have a recording that contains, or that is recorded by 5 people, and then there's a record company, we'll have those 6 parties, the record company and the 5 individuals listed in that. And if you have if you like, the equivalent of an album with 10 recordings, well, you don't need to repeat those names 10 times. You just point to the composite at the beginning and saying, well, it's John again. Well, here, it's John again. Those things are just much more efficient. But you're right, you need to pass this till the end to ingest the information and see what's in it. In principle, and this is for the MLC message as well as the radar 1.5 as we've published it, you basically have these bits of the message, and that goes back to the question, what needs to be read before you actually get to the information. Yes, you need to know what version of this standard are we talking about. This enables you to automatically validate the message. It allows you to point to, the declaration points to the allowed value sets, the code lists that are automatically loaded to validate the message. You then have a message header, which then contains information about who sends the message, to whom, when was it sent. Basic bookkeeping operations. You then have a notification period, and this now, the red and the blue bit, those are it's the bulk of the message, or that's the essence of the message. And we're talking about declaration of sound recording rights claim messages. They have a notification period. For which period am I now declaring my rights? And what are the resources that I'm declaring? And in these individual resource details, I then have titles and recording artists and host sound carriers, so the albums in which they appear, and all of the information that enables the recipient of the message to, number one, identify the work that is there, or populate its internal database with all the data about the sound recording. It will then also contain the information of the rights that are being claimed and so forth. But there are other messages in this standard. So that is the recording, the declaration of sound recording rights claim message. But what happens if a music licensing company has generated revenue, but they don't know anything about a recording that they have been generating revenue for? That they've received, well, they've received revenue or information about revenue that they've generated, but they don't have information about the sound recording. Well, they can request from a record company or maybe a sister society, hey, can you please give me information about this specific musical sound recording? And do you own any rights in there? Do you claim anything there? The response would be, well, a declaration message, wouldn't it? If I've made a claim in error, I can revoke such claims. Note that this is not for the case where I've lost rights. It's for a revocation. Oops, I sent this in error. Revoking would be done through the declaration because I'm still claiming it. It's just another period. And then we have the ones that deal with sales report, declaration of revenue. Those are messages in the original specification that deal with informing an MLC or record company about, well, sales information or usage information. Rights claim status update message is a message that allows a recipient of a declaration message to go back to the sender of the message and saying, here, this is what I've made of your declaration. This enables basically both people, both companies to be on the same side or the same picture. Quite straightforward. And the last one deal about collection mandates, assertion, status update message, and a revocation message. Does really what it says on the tin, similar to the declaration. You have the same kind of choreography there. So those are the messages that the RDR-N standard basically provides, and that we'll talk a little bit more about. And this is the choreography. So a record company or release creator called here decides to make available a release containing sound recordings, or the sound recordings in the absence of a release, makes them available and declares them to a music licensing company. Or a music licensing company that has received label copy information and wants to let another music licensing company know of it, and they will then send this declaration of sound recording rights claim messages to each other. Once received, the status update message can be sent and saying, hey, I've received this. This is what I now made of it. Ideally, it's not a playback of the message, but it's actually a taking the data from the database and playing back what's actually in the database, so that the sender of the original message knows exactly what's going on. And then we have the revocation. That's a very straightforward message. And as I said, if a music licensing company cannot identify the owner of a sound recording that they have now received information and usage figures for, well, then they can ask for that message. And it will then go back to the top diagram. That is the whistle-stop tour over the MLC/RDR-N 1.5 standard, or 1.4 is the MLC standard. If there are any further questions, I'm more than happy to answer. Or Vanessa can do the same, most likely much better than I can.
RDR-N is not really the focus of today, so we wanted to just give a top-level overview of one of the most implemented standards that is currently in use for the RDR working group. The reason why RDR-N is mostly implemented is thanks to the hubs, one of which is the RDX system run by IFPI and VIII. And MLC 1.4 is therefore the version mostly implemented. RDR-N 1.5 is published, and as Niels said, also been implemented by Sound Exchange. The previous slide with all the list of messages is the list of messages included in 1.5, which includes 3 new messages compared to MLC 1.4, which are the mandate messages, again, with the exception of Sound Exchange. Currently, those are not in use. However, in the version that we're currently working on, in RDR-N 2.0, those will be included, of course, because they're quite critical. And the work that the working group is doing currently on RDR-N 2.0 is to harmonize it, but also modernize it. As Niels explained, the really Russian doll-nested way of connecting the territory information with the release information to a sound recording is something that goes way back and does not look at all the way all the other DDEX standards look now. And Mark already made the point about having the common composites. And for those companies that already use the electronic release notification, ERN, it would then be much quicker and easier and more efficient to then also implement the new version of RDR-N, because the structure would look pretty much the same. So the 2 standards we really want to focus on today is the reporting standard and the rights claim conflict standard. The reason being is that those are really the newest ones and the ones the working group has worked on the hardest. And it's also the one that we would like to convince everybody else to adopt and implement as quickly as possible. So we will have a top-level overview of the reporting standard, and then later on go much more into a deep dive into it. The slides may sometimes be a bit wordy. I am not intending to read them all out, but I am hoping that the slides will be used as reference material later on. It will be made available, and therefore I hope it will provide a little bit more context for those who want to go back and understand it a little bit more. So the revenue reporting, RDR-R, is very specific to defining the specifications of revenues generated from the usage of releases and resources. It's the message that goes from the music licensing company to other music licensing companies, or from music licensing companies to the sound recording rights controllers, typically record companies. You have seen in the RDR-N 1.5 or MLC 1.4 list of messages that there are sales reporting messages in those. in XML format. They are, I believe, not used at all. The reason being that reporting sales and line-by-line information in XML is not something that is very efficient. Even our digital sales reporting standard is a flat file, and therefore RDR-R 1.0 is also has been developed as a flat file, which we then have taken and made even more efficient, and that is the topic of today. Just as an overview, as I said, the music licensing company will send this message to rights controller and administrators for the revenue administration of rights controllers and performers, also often referred to as contributors. And it is for sound recording and music videos, but also for revenue attributable to audiovisual resources that contain music. And in addition to that, the music licensing companies also have to declare revenue that is not directly attributable to sound recordings, music videos, or music in audiovisual resources, but also things like taxes, other kind of advances or deductions that then can be reported separately. Version 1.1, congratulations to everyone who was involved in it, has been published. It's been published in like around summertime, and very pleased to say we have already the first test implementation that has taken place. I think that is DDEX's fastest turnaround in publishing and implementing. So thank you, everyone. It enables, like I said, the declaration of revenue from usage of sound recording, music videos, etc., etc. And the aim is really to standardize that communication of revenues in a most simple way, which makes it then cost effective, but most importantly, consistent. There are companies out here that receive many, many reports from various sources at different times in all different formats, which makes it very inefficient from a time perspective and from a resource perspective. And I think this is what we want to improve. And hopefully this information, standardized exchange of information, will be able to then expand on it so that we can not just receive it, but then also analyze it in a much more efficient way. So this is the easiest way of showing how the communication flows. It is the one for the revenue reports that goes from a music licensing company to a record company or sound recording rights holder. So this is the easy one. There is a much more complicated one, which we will go into much deeper detail later on, where the music licensing companies have to first exchange information before ultimately the information is sent to the rights holder. So that was the whistle stop, an overview of really the exchange of revenue in a flat file. It will get more complicated later on. Any questions at this point? Cool. Then, while we were improving the reporting standard, the working group was also working on a completely new set of requirements to publish at the same time a new standard, which is the rights claim conflict standard, or part 4 of the RDR standard to be exact. And using the same principle as for the new version of RDR-R, we wanted to make something so simple, so straightforward that it can be easily implemented by even the smallest players in the market. So this particular part of the RDR standard contains 2 messages. It's a very, very flat file. It's a TVS format. And it is also the first standard that combines not only the specifications of what is expected of you to communicate in which format, but it also outlines a little bit more specifically some business processes around the rights claim conflict, hopefully resolution process, because most of the companies that sit here in the room who have helped developing this standard also use the MLC or RDR-N standard and use RDX, which has got a message, which is the rights claim status update message, which already does some of this discrepancy, notification of errors and conflicts. We have therefore outlined how that would work in parallel. And therefore, as Mark said, DDEX is moving more and more into the space of outlining operational business processes. And RCC has a clause in there where it tries to describe what would happen if you needed to use RCC in parallel of MLC 1.4. So the two messages that are included, it's very simply the message that goes from the music licensing company to the rights holders to notify them that there is a conflict, very simply. And then the return message from the rights holder back to the music licensing company is the response that is complementary to the rights claim status update message. So the simple choreography for those who only use RCC would look like this. You have the music licensing company informing the record company or those who administer the rights for performers that there is a conflict. We have very clearly defined what a conflict is. The message is not for any other discrepancies or for any other errors. It's purely to indicate that more parties have claimed rights to a sound recording in a particular territory for the rights to go above 100.02%. Well, 100%, 02 is a rounding error. So if the claims amount to more than 100%, it's considered a conflict, and therefore the parties need to be notified. And the idea with this particular message is that every party involved in that conflict received the same information about that sound recording in that territory for that usage in question. And then hopefully in mostly iterative process, there will be a response. Obviously, not everybody will do that at the same time. Therefore, there may be several rounds before ultimately the conflict, fingers crossed, is being resolved.